Hello everyone, welcome back to another lore video, and today we're going to be looking more into the lore and story of dragons. Not just any dragons, mind you, but the first set of dragons to come to Westeros. And these are the children of Midgardsormr, or as they are more commonly known as the First Brood. Dragons have always been an important part of any good fantasy story, and 14's no different. We've seen them play important roles since A Realm Reborn, and especially playing a huge part in Heaven's Ward. And recently in Endwalker, we learned about pretty much all of them to a certain extent. So I feel that now is a good time to really look more into the history of these dragons and maybe what we can expect from them later on. Also, there will be some major spoilers here for these games, especially for the Binding Coils of Bahamut, Heaven's Ward, and Endwalker, so please watch at your own risk. So, what do we know about the First Brood? Well, this is the term used for the 7 great worms sired by Midgardsormr. They all spread across the world of Hydaelyn, or Theris as its proper name, and these are primordial dragons. As such, they are the oldest and wisest of living beings on Theris, as well as some of the most powerful. The key source for their power actually comes from the wellspring of ether that's stored in their eyes. Their eyes are the key to their massive strength, and if they lose those eyes, then they most likely will die, as was with the case of what nearly happened to Nidhogg. They can make do with just a single eye, and it's possible that they can actually take the eyes out and put them back in, so that's definitely impressive on that front. And while it is possible for mankind to be able to use and harness the power of the eyes themselves, one has to be extraordinarily careful because it is also very likely that the power could overwhelm them and end up corrupting them to a certain degree. So, in the world of Final Fantasy XIV, where exactly do the dragons come from? Well, all dragons can be traced back to the First Brood. But where did the First Brood come from? Well, they are sired by the father of dragons, Midgardsormr. But where does he come from is the big question. Well, the truth of the matter is that dragons, they're not technically from this world. They're actually from another star light years away. Not that the First Brood remember anything about it. Midgardsormr was originally from a planet known in the common tongue as the Dragon Star, which is a star that was like a perfect paradise for dragonkind. But one day, thousands of years before the start of the storyline, invaders in the form of the Omnicrons, machine lifeforms, attacked the Dragon Star in the hopes of collecting their resources. And as you would imagine, the dragons did not take kindly to this. They battled with the Omnicrons fiercely, but the war dragged on and on, causing massive damage and colossal loss of life to both sides. It was hinted that near the end of the battle, Midgardsormr used the powers of Dynamis to be able to speed up the decay of this world. And so the Dragon Star suffered its own version of the final days on top of dealing with the Omnicron's most advanced and powerful weapon, Omega. Now, Omega was so powerful that only Midgardsormr, considered by many among his kind to be the strongest of them all, was able to stand against it. After a prolonged battle, Midgardsormr was able to gain the upper hand and dealt a devastating attack, thus winning the fight. However, this victory was short-lived, for he could see how this war was going to end. Midgardsormr could see that their world was all but doomed at this point, and thanks to Omega being able to repair itself seemingly endlessly over and over, he knew that this battle was no longer one that they could win. So rather than stay and fight a pointless battle and let their kind die out, he took with him his final cluster of eggs and left the star completely. Before he left, he did try to call out to his kin. He tried to convince them to come with him to see the folly of fighting for a world that was already doomed. Well, the rest of his kin did not take kindly to this, and they've even started calling him a coward and jeered at him for abandoning his home as he left them. But they soon came to realize why he had done so, for thanks to Midgardsormr and the damage done by the Omnicrons, there was really nothing left of this planet to save. And the war pretty much ended when the Omnicrons realized that there really wasn't anything worth conquering anymore, and pretty much left of their own free will, sometime after Midgardsormr fled. The rest of the dragons were left with this dying world, and many others did try to follow Midgardsormr's example and tried to leave with their own eggs to find a new home to settle. It is unknown if there was any other success in doing so, but it was hinted that it doesn't seem likely. The Dragon Star was left to rot from the inside out, leaving the few remaining inhabitants to wait until the end, only a shade of what they used to be left behind. Midgardsormr, however, continued on his way to find a new home to raise his brood and ensure the survival of his species. All the while, Omega was hot on his tail. It's unknown for how long they traveled, but from what we have seen, it was a very long and difficult journey. For the cold of space ended up extinguishing Midgardsormr's fiery mane, leaving him upon the brink of death as he passed by planet after planet, unable to find any hope until he came upon the source world of Aetheris. It's important to note that the star had already been sundered at this point, so the world was already cut into the source and its 13 reflections. It was also here he was finally able to find a place that could support life. When he arrived, he spoke and formed a pact with Hydaelyn for sanctuary, where Midgardsormr vowed to protect this world as he could not save his home star. Here, he seemed to have enjoyed some time of relative peace since he was able to hatch the 7 eggs that he brought with him and raise his children into adulthood before they took to the skies and began to sire their own children. Afterwards, he took his job of protecting this star very seriously. One of the prime examples is when he did battle with the Garleans 15 years before the start of the story in what came to be known as the Battle of Silver Tear Skies. Thus, he was able to destroy the Garleans' warship, the Agrius, where to this day you can actually see the remains of the ship and dragon both where they fell. But as a testament to his power, Midgardsormr did not die from the battle. Instead, he fell into a kind of hibernation before being awakened years later by the Warrior of Light, thus seeing them as a servant of Hydaelyn and stripping them of their blessing of life to test and see if they are worthy of being her chosen champion. It's unknown exactly how much that Midgardsormr knew about Hydaelyn as well as the history of Aetheris itself, but it seems that he did have at least enough knowledge to be able to see just how important it was that the Warrior of Light would be to Hydaelyn. It seems fair that he at least knew what Hydaelyn was and exactly what she was waiting for, so that at least is clear enough. Midgardsormr is just one of those beings that doesn't get too involved. He's someone who prefers to sit back, watch, and see how events unfold, and really only steps in when he feels that he has to say something. After meeting the Warrior of Light and stripping them of the Blessing of Light, he appeared in the form of a tiny dragon pup since then, following after the Warrior of Light and offering information as well as advice, usually involving the first brood. And he only ever spoke when he felt that he had something to say, especially when he spoke with his children, Tiamat and Racevalgar. Though he came to recognize the Warrior of Light's strength and declared them worthy of both Hydaelyn's and his trust. Thus did he see fit to aid them in their quest to put an end to the Dragon Song War. Midgardsormr would later confront with Omega once again. Yes, Omega did follow Midgardsormr all the way to Aetheris before being found and used by the Allegan Empire as a means to be able to do battle with one of the first brood Bahamut before being sealed away. After Omega was awoken by the Alliance to deal with Shinryu, Midgardsormr was able to confront Omega very briefly to rescue the Warrior of Light, whom Omega had been trying to force a result of one of its tests. Though Midgardsormr was able to free the Warrior of Light before they were killed by Omega, it did cost him what little energy he had left. So, unfortunately, he did have to leave us in order to deal with the threat of Omega once and for all. Since then, Midgardsormr has fallen into a kind of hibernation once more, and it is unknown how long it's going to be before he awakens again, if in our lifetimes. But another of his children, Vitra, did reassure us that even in slumber, Midgardsormr watches over this world and the Warrior of Light especially. So that there's everything that we know for sure about Midgardsormr, and his story is largely done for now. There is a little bit of history involving the doomed future that Grahatia came from, but since that technically doesn't happen on this timeline, we're not really going to go into too many details about it, except that around 200 years in this doomed future, right after Graha was sent back in time to the first, Midgardsormr did end up awakening and kind of served as an advisor towards the survivors of this heavily damaged world. So that's pretty much where his story ends for the time being. But what about his 7 children? Well, naming them all off, we have Bahamut, Tiamat, Svalgar, Nidhogg, Ratatoskr, Vitra and Ashdaya. Now, out of the 7, 3 members are confirmed to be dead. 3 are still alive, and there's 1 whose condition remains unconfirmed right now. So, starting off in order, when the first brood grew up and were ready to leave the nest, they broke up into smaller groups, with Bahamut and Tiamat flying off together towards the south to the continents that would later become known as Mericidia. They were a bonded pair and would later bring the Mericidian horde into existence and brought many children into the world together. Later on, when mankind settled down in Mericidia, they would come to Bahamut for his advice and wisdom, where he seemed to have been a kind and noble leader back then. Many different tribes came to live in peace under them for thousands of years, at least until the 3rd astral era, roughly around 5,000 years ago. That was when the Allegan Empire invaded. The Empire attacked their home under the orders of the resurrected Emperor Xande. It was said that with the technology they gained from finding the damaged Omega, they were able to bring low and kill Bahamut, who did try his best to defend his home. His mate, Tiamat, was devastated, and in her grief, she listened to the Ascians, who told her the secret to bringing him back. This would be something that she would come to regret for the rest of her days, however, for what she summoned was a primal, just an imposter of her beloved. And to make matters worse, the Ascians had also prepared the Allegans for this very purpose, the means to seal primals away. So after Bahamut was killed, parts of his ethereal essence were used to recreate an icon in his image, before this imitation of him was sealed within Dalamud, along with many other Mericidian dragons to maintain him. After Bahamut was sealed away, Tiamat, who was devastated over what she had done, allowed herself to be captured and imprisoned by the Allegans in grief. Also, because she was mildly tempered by the icon Bahamut, she also knew the damage that she could do to the world if she was allowed to remain as she was. She was later imprisoned in Azathoth even long after the Allegan Empire fell. She intended to remain imprisoned there for penance for her sins until the end of time. But upon speaking with the Warrior of Light and learning how the Ascians, Vandaniel, was commanding an army of Mericidian dragons, her rage was enough to snap her out of her grief. Thanks to some chiding remarks from Ascian and being cured of her enthrallment, the Scions were able to release her from her prison, where she vowed that she would never again allow her children to be manipulated by the Ascians. She even fought alongside us in defeating the lunar Bahamut that Vandaniel summoned, thus granting her a measure of peace before she returned to Mericidia with the remainder of her brood, intending on protecting them from the servants of darkness from that moment onwards. So that's pretty much everything that we know about the Dawn Worm and the Dusk Worm. So let's go ahead and talk about the next grouping, which is the group of 3. Svalgar, Nidhogg, and Ratatoskr. So these 3 remained together as a group as they flew off further north, eventually settling in what would later become known as Gervania, and they founded the Gervanian horde together. The 3 of them lived in relative peace until the ancestors of the Ishgardians appeared, having chosen to settle within Coerthus, and thus fighting began to break out between both sides. A war erupted that may very well have gone on had it not been for the resolve of an Elysian woman named Shiva. She attempted to parley with the dragons for peace, eventually meeting with Svalgar and both falling in love with each other. Shiva was captivated by Svalgar's wisdom and reason, and in kind, the worm had fallen for Shiva's fiery passion and spirit. But for a dragon, mortal lives are all too short, and he knew that death would take his beloved from him. Unable to bear the thought of their parting, Shiva begged that Svalgar consume her so that their spirits be entwined for all eternity. Upon learning of this sacrifice, the fighting stopped between the 2 sides, thus bringing mortals and dragons together for a time of peace and prosperity for around 200 years. The Sky Lords, in the form of the dragons, entered a truce with the Elysian landlords, and together they built breathtaking structures within the churning mist. You can actually still see these ruins very clearly today. So all of this happened during the 6th astral era. And this probably would have continued on today had it not been for a certain, shall we say, incident that happened 1,000 years before the current storyline. It was the murder of his sister, Ratatoskr, at the hands of Ishgardian's King Thordan I and his knights, which was what destroyed the treaty. Thordan and his knights had tricked and captured Ratatoskr and eaten her eyes, before stealing Nidhogg's as well. Nidhogg convinced Hraesvelgr to give up one of his own eyes to keep him alive as he waged a millennia-long conflict known as the Dragonsong War for the next 1,000 years. As for Hraesvelgr, he retreated to the skies to remain away from all this conflict, having lost all faith in mankind after his sister's murder, only regaining it again upon meeting the Warrior of Light. After we learned the truth of the war's beginnings from him, the Scions and the Warrior of Light were able to return his eye after defeating Nidhogg, and he would later be there to be the one to bear Izel to Azys Lla, thus saving us from the Garleans as we set off to confront the Archbishop. Hraesvelgr also was the one who tested our resolve, and we ended up impressing him so much that he showed up to fight alongside us against Nidhogg's shape, before entrusting one of his eyes to the Warrior of Light to give us the boost we needed to finish him off. The last that we see of Hraesvelgr in the game was right after defeating Omega once and for all. He had appeared as a boon from his father, so he rescued the Warrior of Light, Sid, and Alpha from the collapsing rift after the battle before bidding us farewell. It is unknown currently if we will see him again in the game, but he could very well likely provide some kind of counseling role for the Warrior of Light, or perhaps for Emmerich in the future. As for Nidhogg, he played a huge part in Heavensward as well. Nidhogg was raised to succeed their father as this world's protector. However, unlike some of his other siblings, he held mortals as beneath him, and even grew to hate them after Bahamut's death. After the Ishgardians and the dragons entered their treaty after Shiva's sacrifice, he still loathed mankind. And this was pushed ahead when he discovered Thordan and his knights betraying and slaughtering Ratatoskr for her eyes. He was the first to find out about this, and fell upon them with righteous fury, able to slay Thordan and half of his knights before Thordan's son managed to avenge them by tearing out both of Nidhogg's eyes. Forced to flee, Nidhogg went to his brother Hraesvelgr and demanded one of his eyes so that he could take revenge on the Ishgardians, which Hraesvelgr granted. As for Nidhogg's eyes, one of them was kept in the church's safeguard, having joined with Haldret's body after he succumbed to its influence, while the other eye was used by a long line of dragoons, thus granting a new dragoon each generation the strength of dragons and used in the defense of the city. Nidhogg would then spend the next 1,000 years battling with the Ishgardians for revenge, gradually losing his mind in the process. 1,000 years later, Nidhogg was confronted by the Azure Dragoon Estinian, who was a victim of his hatred when he burned down his home settlement and killed his family a few years before, and the Warrior of Light in his own lair. Together they were able to put an end to him and return the eye to Hraesvelgr, but Nidhogg's vengeful spirit would not rest. For with Estinian's blood-soaked armor and having gained possession of both of Nidhogg's eyes, the worm was able to possess his body and return to continue on with the Dragonsong War. It wasn't until Nidhogg brought his all to bear against the city itself when Hraesvelgr did battle against the shade of his brood brother to help him to rest once and for all. The Warrior of Light pushed Nidhogg back into Estinian's form, where Estinian awoke from within and was able to regain temporary control of his body to give his friends time to tear the eyes from the armor and set him free permanently. The eyes were then tossed off the side of the bridge only to be found by the Asians, who in turn gave the eyes to Ilbert to use as a means to summon a primal to destroy Garlemald. Perhaps it was the influence of Nidhogg's eyes, for the ether took on the form of a new dragon, one now known as Shinryu. Xenos would then gain control of Shinryu before meeting his end at the hands of the Warrior of Light, leaving the eyes drained of ether afterwards. But Estinian was the one who was able to make sure that Nidhogg's eyes were destroyed once and for all, and to ensure that they couldn't be used again, which then put an end to the Wyrms' hatred. As for Ratatoskr, sadly not much is known about her because, again, she was slain about 1,000 years before the start of the story. We do know that she was supposed to have the most beautiful song of any dragon and that she doted upon mankind, even going as far as to bless certain warriors with armor. She was the main emissary between Ishgard and the dragons during the time of peace, but it seems that she may have been a bit too honest with the people of their powers. She apparently went to speak with them days prior to her death, where she explained to them of the power of the eyes, as well as how Nidhogg truly felt about mankind, how he felt that mankind just wasn't strong enough to be able to protect the star, which may have triggered some kind of irrational fear inside of Thordan and his knights. Thus did they feel that they had no choice but to gain the power of dragons themselves, which unfortunately ended up breaking their treaty. They lured her in under the guise of a discussion, only to trap and slaughter her as they ripped out her eyes. As she lay there dying, Thordan and his knights devoured her eyes and thus gaining her power in their blood. It stands to reason that when she realized what was going on, she roared out for aid, which was probably how her brother Nidhogg showed up so quickly. Sadly, her murder would be the incident that sparked the beginning of the Dragon Song War, and the descendants of the knights who ate her eyes would continue to live on within the Ishgardian people. So just about everyone in Ishgard seems to be some kind of descendant from the original 12. And Ratatoskr's power still lives on in their blood, and all it takes is a single sip of dragon's blood to fully awaken it. That is why the Ishgardians are able to transform into dragons, thus where we come across with the heretics. So that's basically everything that we know about those three. And finally we come to the last two members of the first brood. We have Vitra and Ashdaya. So we know that Vitra was the youngest member of the first brood. The others had already long since hatched by that point, and his egg was the last to hatch. He himself confirms that. And for whatever reason, it seems that before Vitra's egg hatched, Midgardsormr went into a kind of hibernation again, which led Ashdaya to protect and keep his egg warm and safe. Vitra tells us that Ashdaya was the one who took care and protected him when he was young. So the two of them appear to have been very close, with Vitra speaking out how important Ashdaya was to him, how even long after he learned to defend himself, he rarely strayed from her side. However, during the Third Astra era, when Emperor Xande made a pact with the Cloud of Darkness, thus attacking Mericidia, they came to the aid of Tiamat's Roar of Defiance. The two of them fought side by side against an army of Voidsent, but with the overwhelming forces against them, especially with Bahamut's death, it didn't seem that it would end in their favor, at least not while the Void Gate remained opened. It was here that Ashdaya sacrificed herself in an attempt to stop them by flying straight into the Void Gate to strike at the heart of their forces. Vitra attempted to follow her to lend her his aid, but as he came upon the rift, it sealed itself off. Whether or not it was intentional or not is hard to say, but it ended with Ashdaya being trapped within the void. Whether she is still alive, however, is currently unknown. Heartbroken over the disappearance of his sister, Vitra dedicated himself to search for a means to rescue her from the rift. Eventually, he found it in the form of a small fissure tear into the void itself beneath the waters of the Bounty, and settled upon the Isle of Thavnar. It seemed that he was trying to work out a way to open the rift as he settled upon the Mesa where Razadhan would one day be built, thus earning the respect and distance of the inhabitants of the Isle during this time. But when marauding Hures arrived and fighting broke out between the tribes, it was Vitra who stepped in and put a stop to all the fighting, thus the foundation of Razadhan was born. When the city was built, he enlisted the aid of the alchemists to find a way to open up the tear so that they could find his sister. After years of study and experiments, they found a way to create a tiny opening, just large enough for a child to slip through, but it was stable enough to remain open. Vitra then used a homunculus or a simulacrum to be able to cross over the thresholds to investigate. But sadly, instead of finding any clues about his sister, he found only a swarm of Voidsent waiting for him. He was left with the difficult decision to reseal it, thus abandoning his sister to her fate, whatever fate that was. Afterwards, using an Alrai bloodline to serve as a figurehead, he worked in the shadows to protect the nation, serving as the true ruler from behind the literal curtain, using another one of his puppets. With his eye placed inside the simulacrum, he was able to observe events and maintain this ruse to prevent Thavnar from being invaded by other nations. For he had seen how the violence between dragon and mankind has torn apart lives in fear that if word got out that a dragon was the set trap of an entire nation, this would tempt other nations to invade. So it was for this reason he remained hidden for thousands of years, later offering his aid to the Warrior of Light and the Scions when the Tower of Zot appeared and his people were being abducted to power them. With this, he encouraged aid from his alchemists to find a way to protect one from being tempered, and his scales were used to create the warding scales to protect one from a primal's influence, which was how the Scions were able to storm the tower and eventually free the people of Thavnar from the Telophoroi. He later would appear again when the final days came to Thavnar and had been fighting off the horde of blasphemies on his own until the Scions showed up to offer their aid. By the end of it, and the death of his dear friend Ahiwan, Vitra was finally able to work up the courage to come out and reveal the truth to the people. Upon learning of his dedication to their citizens, they were more touched by this than they were upset about his deception, and it seems that they all welcomed him as their one true leader. When the final days were in full swing, he did his best to keep the people calm and to protect the city as best he could, eventually allowing his simulacrum to be able to cross the sea to Sharlayan so that he could enlist the aid of his brothers and sisters. Eventually being able to cross the seas to Sharlayan in the form of his simulacrum so that he could keep aware of everything that was going on. He then went ahead and donated much of his scales, as well as speaking with his brother and sister, Race Valgar and Tiamat, and seeing if they would be able to donate their scales to the Ragnarok. He even went as far as to speak with his father, Midgardsormr, who also donated a portion of his scales to outfit the entire starship so that they could help the Warrior of Light and the Scions reach Medion, thus putting an end to the final days. Vitra also has the difficult task of trying to put Thavnar back together. Out of all the nations that suffered from the final days, Thavnar definitely seems to be the one that was the most affected. So Vitra had his hands full trying to rebuild the nation back up to what it once was, though he himself admits that it has left deep scars that he doesn't think that they'll ever fully heal from. Despite all this, and using some hidden treasure that he was storing away for a rainy day, it does seem that Thavnar is well on its way to a full recovery. However, despite his prodigations that he doesn't see any hope for Ashdaya, it doesn't seem that he completely gave up hope over rescuing and being reunited with his sister. And with some encouragement from the Warrior of Light and reassurances from his people, he has agreed to continue on with his search. And that is everything that we know so far about the First Brood. I was always fascinated by these 7 dragons, and I'm so happy that we got to learn so much more about them. I have a feeling that there will be much to look forward to as the rest of 6.2 and future patches come out. So maybe I'll do a part 2 later on. We still need to learn about the fate of Ashdaya, and I am holding out hope that we will be able to visit Mericidia one day. If we do, that's an almost guarantee to show us Tiamat again, as well as to learn more about Bahamut. So yeah, I do think that we haven't seen the last of the First Brood yet, and I really hope that they don't choose to abandon that whole concept because again, I love the First Brood. I love how different each one of them is, and I really can't wait to find out more about them. Anyway, that's going to be it for right now. Thank you all so much for joining me today, and I hope that everyone's looking forward to what they have to show us next. Here's hoping that we're able to reunite Ashdaya and Vitra, as well as learning more about the dragons in the future. A fantasy game just doesn't feel like a fantasy game without having a dozen-odd dragons to me. Anyway, that's it for right now. This is Fantasy Girl signing out.
Even cowering behind my curtain, I know the suffering of the powerful. I have watched my siblings driven mad by loss.